Hi everyone, welcome to this IFPRI policy seminar that it was co-organized also with the University of Adelaide and funded by USAID. It is a real pleasure to have you all here. And we have an amazing program today. So we know that agricultural subsidies are high and increasing while highly concentrated in just a few countries and commodities. There is also a need to think of finding the best way of reforming agricultural policies to better fit the world we live in today and finding a proper balance across all the dimensions from food security, nutrition, sustainable development objectives. In doing so, we will be faced with some trade-offs. And here is when the existence of evidence is key at this time of deciding of how food and agricultural policy support could be reformed in a way that will improve the agri-food system efficiency, will increase availability, and reduce also the cost of nutritious foods. All this by providing strong incentives to reduce greenhouse emissions and adapt to climate change, while of course natural resources are used sustainably. In this seminar, we will discuss the impact of harmful environmental impacts and agricultural subsidies, acknowledging also these trade-offs that I just mentioned between the economic, the social, and environmental priorities, and of course, the repurposing of them. We will discuss options with a focus on international perspective and potential for international cooperation if and it will be required. So we will hear first from two keynote speakers. So we will have Kenash, and I will introduce them properly when it is their time, but he will comment on the latest report from the Institute for International Trade on agricultural subsidies. And then we will hear from David Laborde, that he will also give us some comments about the latest work done by IFPRI on this subject. And then it will be followed by 4 fantastic discussants that will give us their perspectives on the topics. We will have Leanne Jackson, Sophia Murphy, Joseph Glauber, and Nelson Illescas. And again, I will introduce them properly when it is time for that. So before I give the floor to Rob Boss, who is the Director of Markets, Trade and Institutions here at IFPRI, to give the welcoming remarks. I would like to just remind you that we want to hear from you. And if you want to participate in our Q&A session that will follow the discussants' remarks, please submit your questions on ifpri.org, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, or by using the hashtag AskIFPRI on Twitter. And with this, Rob, the floor is all yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Valeria, for this introduction. I'm very happy to give a few opening remarks, but it will be very brief because we have a terrific lineup of speakers to introduce the issues to you. But just in brief, I think what we're talking about is the $800 billion question, the $800 billion that, or around that government spent every year in supporting agriculture and through its food systems, with support particularly focused on farm level support. This support over the decades very likely has been very instrumental to push up productivity and production levels, but there's also major concerns that this has gone at great cost of the environment and developing a food system that is delivering a lot, but not enough. And it's not delivering on food security, it's not delivering on poverty reduction, and it's not delivering on environmental health of the planet. So I think these are the issues at stake. The work that will be presented here, the analysis undertaken, builds on work that we've been undertaking over the past couple of years, including for the World Bank and FAO and other organizations, and also what we've put on the agenda of several international platforms, the G20, the G7, at COP, the various COP meetings, last year COP26, and also this year COP27. It's been put on the agenda to make clear that while we spend all these resources to support agriculture, it is not helping to improve the environment or fight climate change. So how to do that? That's question number one. We'll hear more about it, but also hope that we can discuss, okay, how to drive and move the needle in terms of how can we repurpose, but also in ways that would be congenial to actually act on it. Since we've put this on the agenda, we have not seen a lot of great movements in reforming agricultural policies. So it's as important as understanding what needs to be done. Also as important is how should it be done in ways that it will indeed be effective. So I hope to hear more in this panel about this and clear some space also the political fronts to make this acceptable as necessary as the agenda is. So with that, let me give it back to Valeria, and I look forward to a very fruitful and stimulating discussion.
Thank you very much, Rob, for your introductory remarks. So let's start with Ken Ash. He is visiting fellow of the Institute for International Trade, IIT, and the University of Adelaide. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ken. It's so nice to have you here.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you, Rob, Valeria. Look, I'm going to make a few comments over the next 10 minutes, drawing primarily on a recent review of published literature on agricultural support and its impacts on the environment and on climate. This is work that was undertaken by a colleague, Anthony Cox, as well as colleagues of both of ours at the Institute for International Trade at the University of Adelaide. And Peter Draper will maybe say a few words at the end of this as well. The motivation and the funding for this particular review was provided by Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. So that's by way of background. The first substantive point I want to make is, look, we know an awful lot already about agricultural support from both WTO and OECD data and analysis. The WTO data are based on notifications by its members and organized according to domestic support commitments that they made in 1995. Those commitments distinguish, on the one hand, between support that clearly distorts production and trade. So that's subsidies that are based on input use and output quantities, as well, though, regulatory measures that support domestic prices at levels higher than international prices. Now, distortionary support can be available under the Your Way Round agreement, but within limits. On the other hand, minimally or non-trade distorting support can be available without limits. So support for public goods, for general services, for activities, contributions to the sector that are not directly linked to current farm production decisions. The latest year that comprehensive WTO data are available is 2016, when the most trade distorting support totaled just over $80 billion US. During the same year, support linked to development goals and direct payments with production limits totaled over $40 billion US, while minimally or non-trade distorting support was over $400 billion US. Over 80% of this support was provided by just 10 of the WTO's 164 members. And there is little constraint today to distorting support increasing further. The permissible limit today is about $1 trillion US, so more than 10 times the actual level of support. And that limit is expected to increase to double to about $2 trillion over the next 8 years. The OECD data, on the other hand, cover fewer countries, but still 75% of global agricultural value added. And they're not organized according to legal commitments. They're organized according to an economic framework that allows for analysis of the incidence and the impact of policies that are actually in place. OECD estimates are available up to 2021. In recent years, support has been increasing, and over the past 3 years, averaged more than $611 billion US annually. 60%, roughly 60% of this support is delivered by the most distorting forms of policy instruments. So we know a lot, and I've just given you the tip of the iceberg. We know a lot about agricultural support. And there's a growing body of research as well that's looking at not just how that support might impact production decisions and subsequent trade flows, but it's looking at environmental impacts. Now, in a nutshell, production-linked support changes the economic incentives of farmers and often leads to unintended negative environmental outcomes today. There's widespread agreement in the literature on the causal pathways, referred to as the intensive margin, the extensive margin, and the entry-exit margin. And I want to just very briefly illustrate each of those. So in a very practical sense, input and output subsidies encourage, no surprise, increased use of inputs and more intensive stocking rates and cropping practices, often leading, for example, to overuse of pesticides and fertilizers, increased runoff, and to higher greenhouse gas emissions. Production and price support encourages extensification of production systems and changes in land use, bringing fragile land or pasture into crop production, for example, and endangering biodiversity and carbon sinks. Output-based support encourages bringing new land into production, increasing deforestation and soil erosion, and decreasing carbon sinks and natural habitats. Now, all of this is pretty negative. Agricultural support can also have positive impacts on the environment, for example, by targeting habitat provision, carbon storage, and so on. But the facts are, over the past 3 years, on average, less than $10 billion targeted provision of these kinds of environmental public goods, in contrast to the hundreds of billions of US dollars committed to production-linked support. Now, our review also highlights two major reports which were released just recently. The first by the FAO, UNDP, and UNEP, and the second by the World Bank Group just earlier this year. Both looked at the effects on emissions of repurposing agricultural support, as Valeria has referred to. And she referred to them, I expect, because the underlying analysis for both of those reports was undertaken by IFPRI. And I'm pretty sure David will say a few words about those in a couple of minutes. Now, our review takes a global perspective, but I want to note as well that there's a great deal of research available on the much more local impacts of agricultural support on land, water, and biodiversity. So what does all this mean? Yes, we know that agricultural support is high. We've known that for at least 27 years and maybe closer to 45. We know that agricultural support is highly concentrated. Much of it distorts production and trade and is environmentally harmful. And we also know that multilateral trade rules are becoming less binding over time. So we are suggesting in our report 2 avenues need to be pursued. The first is making the available information and analysis more accessible, more penetrable to policymakers, while at the same time filling some important knowledge gaps. We can talk more about those gaps a little later if you wish, but even the best information is not enough. Our second suggestion is about creating a coalition of stakeholders, a diversity of interests, and to try to increase the coherence of our messages. There's a lot of information available, but there's also a lot of noise out there. And who should policymakers listen to? What is the truth, or what is the complete set of up-to-date facts upon which they can begin to make difficult and important choices? So we suggest we need a network in order to build a much improved but evidence-based narrative and to bring it to places like the WTO, but also to APEC, G20, G7, and other international platforms. And I think we also talk about the need to be open to new ways forward. I mean, what we've done for the last 27 years since the Uruguay Round Agreement was signed is not working, clearly. There's interesting conversations in the WTO in the context of the trade and environmental sustainability structured discussions. That's a ray of hope. Maybe we need to think harder about a plurilateral on agriculture. And maybe it's time to talk about serious subsidy reform, not just agriculture, but across a range of sectors: fisheries, fossil fuels, industrials, semiconductors. Subsidies are a reasonably healthy growth industry at the moment, and bringing a little discipline to some of that conversation, as ambitious as that might sound, might provide an interesting or a positive platform. Two final points, Valeria. We don't talk enough, and we note this in the paper, as experts, we don't talk enough about the enormous opportunity costs of existing subsidies. You know, money spent on production-based income transfers is money not available for agricultural R&D, climate mitigation, digital applications in agriculture, and it's not even money that's available for hospital beds, schools, and other essential services. Last point, I want to be super clear on this. Not all subsidies are bad, but neither are they all good. Okay, this is not about eliminating agricultural support. This is about ensuring that support works as intended, that the policy instruments chosen are well in line with the explicit objectives stated by government, and that the inevitable trade-offs and the unintended impacts of policies that are put in place are anticipated and brought into the decision-making process. So with that, thank you, and I look forward to the conversation.
Again, thank you. Thank you so much for your comments. I really like the idea of creating a coalition for cooperation, and I will add also some transparency into that. And of course, with your last comment about not all subsidies are bad, but not all of them are good. So that's a good way of ending this. So now let me give the floor to David Laborde. He's Senior Research Fellow here at IFPRI. David?
Yes, thanks, Valeria, and thanks also to Ken to have done a great beginning of the discussion, and I will actually follow up on a number of his points. So what I'm going to do is basically give you a summary of some of the things we have done at IFPRI and things that we have learned, or at least I have learned. During my overview, I'm going to talk about various pieces of work that we have done. So within, in particular, the Market and Trade Institution Division at IFPRI. So the work I am going to refer to involve work done with and by Valeria, Glauber that will talk after, Laborde that has already talked, but also Will Martin and Abdullah Mamoun. And so it's already a collective effort here. I just give a kind of summary of the situation. So what we have done on this topic, I mean, we have worked on farm policies at least for 15 years, and actually IFPRI has worked for more time on that. But we really start to frame it in terms of repurposing in 2018. And in 2020 and in 2021, you see these three bunch of work. The one in the middle has been referred by Ken in the UNDP FAO report, the $1 billion opportunity. And we had the first piece with the World Bank in 2020, and we look at some scenario for the UN Food System Summit. And the initial starting point was really looking at environmental impact through the lens of agricultural emission, of the current policies, and then step by step understanding among the agricultural support space, which instrument may have a stronger effect on climate, on nature, on some nutrition indicators, but also equity in terms of poverty. And starting in 21, we were starting to see if we change the purpose of policy and we start to reallocate the money, can we get something that is more climate friendly or nutrition friendly? In 2022, three pieces of work. Another piece with the World Bank, where actually we look at some of the green innovation and productivity innovation that can be done when they target also emission reduction. We contributed to the Sophia 2022 report, where the question of diets was much more the key focus, but also the different trade-off. I will refer to it after. And last but not least, when we start to think, if some of the policy targets are mainly a consumer level target or a producer level target, and when we think about food system, where the subsidies should go when we need subsidies. But also in ongoing work with the Food System Economic Commission, we think about different valuation of the existing policies, but also can we make it work for the global south? Because I think that's going to be an important topic. Some of these discussions are really taking place in the north, when some of the outcome and needed outcome of transforming the system should occur in the global south. So what we have learned. 7 points, I'm going to detail some of them. But first, I think that we have to acknowledge that farm policies are complex and diverse. Sometimes they can be implemented at a very detailed level, and people can be prone to oversimplification. It's not like if we have a big pot of money with all the support and we can start to redistribute it freely. Some of the support are not subsidies, and I think that's very important to keep it in mind. We don't have $1 billion or $800 million of public money spent on farmers. We have actually half of it, between 350 and 400 billions, because a lot of the support go through price manipulation. But price manipulation is not fiscal space, and actually price support is going to increase price. So we'll have a negative impact on demand when subsidies overall are going to push price down, and we'll have a positive effect on demand. So really keeping this different landscape of policy is important. They are also just a part of the decision made by farmers, and depending the size of the subsidies, some countries, farmers really look at them. In other countries, they are much less impacted by subsidies because there is very few, meaning that it doesn't mean there is no environmental problem. So really, I think we also have to understand that the environmental problems we associate with agricultural production are not synonymous with the environmental problems that are associated with subsidies. And in some cases, as it has been said, some of these subsidies can help solving the environmental problems, but in other cases, when they just scale up production, they just make things worse. And that's where we need to keep these things. Third point about policy space, sometimes, between the ex-ante policy goals and policy design and the ex-post impact, we can have things that are of a different nature. And so, what is an harmful subsidies? Some good subsidies on the paper can have harmful impact, and sometimes some not so good subsidies on the paper had led to interesting response by farmers in terms of innovation or investment. So even, finding this proper language is going to be challenging. And I think that also the example raised by Ken is very interesting, because if you look at some of the discussion on subsidy at the WTO, they are first of all a legal discussion. When if you move to the OECD type of analysis, they are much more an economic and actual impact discussion. So how we breed this different community is important. The next group of things is when we want to change policies. In many cases, these policies, it takes place at the country level or a group of countries like the European Union, but some of these environmental impacts are cross-border. And that's going to make the story a bit more difficult, even if much more, especially when we think about climate goals. Now, removing all subsidies today in some of the more recent work we do is going actually to be a bad idea. So the goal is not to just make this money disappear, but use it differently. And the question of sustainable productivity is key, because people are going to continue to eat. So the total volume of production on Earth is not going to collapse if we change subsidies, but there's a lot of redistribution taking place. Now, we started to say, okay, we're interested in environment, we're interested in diets, we're interested in social impact. But then when we look at the policy reform process, sometimes, keep things simple help, one policy, one target, we deliver on that. When at the opposite, if we want to solve all the problems just with one big reform, that can be too big to swallow. Last but not least, as I've said, how we deal with global south. So in the 3 minutes I still have, I will focus on first these 3 first point. And just to say, yes, we have to keep in mind that we have subsidies and trade policy measures. They all also have their own political economy. They all have their own fiscal space implication. And these different instruments are going to change how much we produce, so the scale of what we do. And let's be honest today, the more we produce, the more we damage the environment. That's the basic story that we see. It can change what we produce in terms of product and where we produce them. So that's where actually it shifts the overall production in terms of space and geographical and product space. But also, and that's maybe the more challenging, is how we can use this subsidy to change how we produce things in a more sustainable way. Knowing that you have also producers in the world today that are doing it in a sustainable way without receiving payments. So it's not like if you need to be paid to be sustainable. I think it really depends also of initial institution, how initial property rights have been defined on land, on water, and things like this. And so in the process of policy reform, that's going to be important, because do we want to pay people more to do something more? Or just do we say, okay, no, you receive money from the government, you're expected to do A, B, and C. It's not like if you have already enshrined rights on some of the payment by the government. Now, also, sometime when we talk about harmful subsidies, I was saying, there's a lot of subtlety. So before I already referred that input subsidies and output subsidies are linked to production. So really the scale effect matters. But even if you look at the input subsidies of the OECD, you will see that they are not all bad. Okay, from the beginning, there are some categories of input subsidies that are linked to environment. There is some that can be linked to risk management. Some are linked to extension services when they are provided by your private companies. And I think that most experts will accept this idea that they are pretty good policies. When things that give you tax rebate to use fossil fuel, not really a good policy, So we have to keep in mind this detail. And even in a category like irrigation, we can have payment for irrigation that lead to an overuse of water, or you can have payment for irrigation that is to adopt a drip irrigation. So that's sometimes the level of detail we have to go in. On the cross-border effect and the fact that removing all existing policy can actually have a negative impact, something that is linked to what we do with the Food Security Economic Commission, and where it can lead to the surprising result, at least for some, that if we remove policy today, we are going to have global cost. And it's mainly coming from a reduction in production of countries like China or in Europe, shifting production in Latin America or in Africa, where this production can actually lead to loss of biodiversity, carbon, that have a much higher value than the current damage that is done in Europe. Basically, the marginal damage on biodiversity in Europe has a low price. If we start to move to land where there is a high carbon and biodiversity stock in the tropical area to replace the production, then the global balance is negative. But of course, and that's what you see on the right-hand side of this slide, there's also a number of uncertainty. And I want us to make clear, when you do this modeling, there is a level of uncertainty, evaluation of carbon, evaluation of biodiversity, but also how we should value some of these losses. Now, moving to my conclusion and the last aspect of it. Yes, here I present a very oversimplified story of farm policy goal, but I think it's kind of interesting to keep this in mind. During maybe after World War II, both in advanced economy and in middle income economy today, so at the time they were even poor, farm policy were about producing more intensification, and in some cases also targeting self-sufficiency goals. Some of these policies were also basically hurting producers to help consumers by maintaining, some food prices low, but you were compensating with subsidies. But the goal was to really produce more. Over time, especially in the US and in Europe, the goal of supporting farmer income has become much more important. And so some policy instruments were used to do that. Then starting in the 90s, we have actually seen the environmental questions coming up. And so some of this money were paid to be more environmentally friendly, or at least just even to protect land. And now we start to see health and nutrition topics coming. But you see, we are increasing the space and the number of problems that sometimes we try to solve with farm policies, and we may have to be careful about that. And I'm just going to conclude by taking some of the work we have done with Joe Glauber for the Sophia report, where on this graph, what you see is for the world and different group of countries, the outcome of some of this repurposing scenario in a space where vertically you have the amount of emission and horizontally you have the affordability of healthy diet. So if you have a point like this one here, it means that at the same time you make healthy diet more affordable, but you also produce more emission. So that's typically the type of outcome we don't want. But in the policy we have looked at, you can see that there's a number of cases here for high-income countries where we can improve affordability of healthy diet and reduce emission, the type of outcome we want. But for low-income countries, a lot of these policies that are mainly driven by the change in the north will translate by adverse effect for them, either just in terms of emission or in some cases, even in emission and affordability of healthy diet. So really, this is this trade-off that are important among objective, but among countries in a situation where most of the money is basically in the north, plus India and China, where a number of environmental and social challenges are in other countries in low and middle income case. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, for your comments. I really like the way you highlighted that the policies are done at a domestic level, but if you're looking at environmental impacts, we see it at the global. So the importance of bringing also the global south into the discussion and being participants in all this. And now I would like to move to the second part of this seminar. And before that, I would like just to remind you that you can ask questions on IFPRI.org, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, or by using the hashtag AskIFPRI on Twitter. So now let me please introduce Leanne Jackson. She's the head of division from the Agro-food Trade and Markets from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD. Leanne, it's such a pleasure to have you here with us, and the floor is all yours.
Thanks so much, Valeria. It's really a pleasure to be here. And to discuss these two great pieces of work. Ken's comments about all the data that have been put together over time at the WTO and the OECD, and also what we have seen about the trends in support to agriculture over time and how it really should be motivating us to change. And David's comments talking about making sure we have a global picture and really digging into these trade-offs and pulling together evidence across lots of different objectives was also really resonating with me as I was listening to these presentations. So when I was thinking about my remarks, a lot of the work that my team is doing at the OECD is focusing on this food systems approach, which I think we heard through the themes that were coming in from Ken and David. And of course, here the issue is that we're talking about multiple objectives, and we heard that through both of the previous speakers. And it's kind of shifting the paradigm of how we're thinking about agriculture. We're trying to think about how can we create food systems that can provide food security and livelihoods and do it in an environmentally sustainable way. So we're really pushing the envelope to think about what it takes to think in a systems way. We heard, and if you looked at the paper that Ken put together with the University of Adelaide, you can see lots of good evidence has been put together over time. Lots of research has been going into making the case for why we need to have this paradigm shift and to really be thinking about new ways of thinking about support to agriculture to achieve these multiple objectives. But we haven't seen much change. So how do we actually go about shifting the paradigm? One of the pieces of research my team does every year is in collaboration with the FAO. We do these 10-year commodity projections. And last year we looked at what it would take to what kind of productivity improvements would it take to achieve SDG 2, solving global hunger, at the same time addressing some of the Paris climate objectives. And the number that we came up with through our modeling was there would have to be 3 times the productivity increases that we've seen on average over the past 10 years. So it's really, just to stress the point that it's really a dramatic change we're looking at if we want the world to move in the direction that we say we want to be moving in. So why is it so hard to transform? We have evidence and analysis talking about how existing policies, particularly agricultural support, create stickiness in terms of systems adapting, economic incentives that keep farmers producing in a particular way, creating market distortions that keep production from shifting, even if the other incentives are shifting around it. So clearly we have evidence that's telling us that something needs to happen. And the question is, what does it take to get the change to happen? One of the issues, I think, is transparency. And I think when we say transparency, we use it as a catchword, but actually there's a whole range of different kinds of transparency. I think that some of the suggestions that were put forward in the paper that Ken was talking about talks about different ways of synthesizing information, mobilizing data so that policymakers and decision makers can actually see the whole picture, maybe not so granular, take broader decisions and being able to compare across time, but transparency also takes consistent investment. So one of the good things about both the OECD and WTO over the past couple of decades is that there is this year after year collection of data, but how it's been put together to make the arguments for change, maybe we can think more creatively about how to merge those two kinds of data. But I think there's a deeper reason why it's hard to change, and that's because it's not just evidence that makes people change. We know that in food systems and thinking about food systems change, we have differences in the way people think about facts and evidence, but we also have differences across interest groups, and we have differences in values. And when we're talking about food and agriculture and environment and inclusive livelihoods, we have a huge range of values that we have to be thinking about as we're trying to put together momentum towards change. And we have seen in food systems in more recent years some efforts that countries are taking to try to have deliberative processes where they bring citizens together. For example, the Irish Citizens Assembly is a good example where they sort of grapple with complicated issues, and they have a representative group of citizens that come together to talk about it and to be faced with evidence and given the chance to dig into the evidence. I think a little bit more effort thinking about navigating some of those the stickiness across interests and values would also help in terms of figuring out how to make this paradigm shift. And then the third thing that reading the paper made me think about was, how do we think about breaking down silos? What are the communities that we're actually talking about if we're trying to put together groups or coalitions who have the appetite to try to find a common approach to reforming in agriculture? Clearly, we have to think about the different silos in countries across different ministries. We have to be thinking also, if we're thinking about WTO rules and disciplines, the different agreements that might be touching on agriculture. So we, of course, the agreement on agriculture where lots of these rules are sitting, but the work in environment, work on SPS, work on TBT, there's lots of different areas within existing rules where there are nuggets of wisdom that if we could find a way of having the conversation across those communities and those sets of rules, I think we might be able to find a stronger momentum towards finding appetite for change. So I thought the paper and also David's presentation really set us up for a very good discussion and the world is changing fast. Technology is changing fast. The climate is changing fast. We need to find a way to also get the agricultural system, the agri-food system to change in pace with what's going on in the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Leanne. Thank you very much. I actually really like the word stickiness. I haven't heard it in this context, and I do think that it really applies very well. Thank you. So with this, let me pass the floor to Sophia Murphy. She is the Executive Director of the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, the IATP. Sophia, thank you very much for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Valeria. Thank you for this chance. And I'm very happy to come. It's such an issue and a subject area I've looked at for far more years than I would really like to count. And congratulations, really an amazing report, well written, very clear, a nice review of a lot of information. And I especially appreciate that it included both national and global studies, because I think that brings out, especially for the politics, but maybe also for the ways forward. I think we may find them coming up from the ground up, if you like. So that was great. And also, of course, this conversation now is impossible without thinking about trade-offs, and I'm very happy that that's the case. So a few quibbles, some smaller, and then into some bigger questions that I still feel need to be aired, even if you've heard me say some of them before. And some have already been touched on. Really appreciate, David, your 7 points that you put into that ARC slide. But one, this question always, is trade distorting the most important quality? And I think we're getting at a lot of other things in the report, and that's important. But just to remember, from a lot of countries' point of view, the trade distortingness of their policy doesn't really matter to them. And so how do we deal with that? It does matter to others. We do have the spillovers. I don't want to say it's not important, but the market price support has a very different, logic and support in different places. And so how do we think about that? And I guess linked to that the OECD is not the world, which I think is also the point that David is making. And I think is really hard to keep in mind with the global studies, especially when we're trying to simplify the message so a policymaker will pay attention. So that challenge to us of how do we deal with the other 100 or so countries that are not even in the larger sense of OECD, captured in the data. And I would agree the WHO data is useful, but it's really different. It is more comprehensive, but also patchy. Joe and I and others looked at that a few years ago, and who actually notifies is another transparency question. We don't have the best data. And then to come to some larger questions, one is this issue of market concentration, power in the supply chain, and what else farmers respond to, and how do we allow for that in the modeling we want to do and in the assumptions we have about why programs work in a certain way or don't. The point that farmers will grow food with or without subsidies is clearly true, but also that they're growing food in response to a lot of different pressures, among which are the public subsidies that exist. And you see, I think, this conversation, like the plethora of net zero plans and the heroic assumptions about what land is going to do in those net zero plans and what role farmers are going to play in food companies' supply chains, raise a lot of questions about what is going to be incentivizing what kind of farmer behavior, and where the public money will align in that, I think, is going to be really important. It seemed to me, sitting in the climate change negotiations in Sharm el-Sheikh, that there's a tidal wave of private money coming from outside agriculture, looking to buy, I think of them as indulgences, like medieval Catholic Church. They want to buy off the pressure on them to reduce their emissions by stacking some carbon in the soil someplace, or maybe planting a forest or doing something else. And that private money, which is not responding to agricultural economics, is, I think, a really important piece of understanding how agriculture might change shape, how we might deal with things. And my impression was that agricultural ministries in both rich and poorer countries are quite excited about the potential to realize money coming from these offsets and removals proposals. And I think there's some real risks in there. One example, just to quickly give something more concrete, the emergence of this interest in biogas production in the United States, which depends on methane from massive lagoons created by confined animal feeding operations. And so you're doing something useful with a nasty product, but you're also building in a new incentive for production of methane, which we actually want to reduce. And at the same time, and from the political point of view, you're undermining decades of work from the communities that live by those confined animal operations, who deal with significant health issues, water quality issues, air quality, pollution, and they're fighting to end that. And so you want to make sure that your environmental subsidy to do something positive for the climate is not at the same time disrupting what the local community needs from its farm system. So that's about really the complicated politics. I'm just thinking through what to say and how not to rush it. I think there's some important comparison maybe with the 80s and now about who uses the subsidies. They were even more concentrated maybe when we were negotiating the Uruguay round, US and EU, but both those powers wanted to reduce their subsidies. And then the Cairns Group was a fairly interesting coalition of quite different countries with a more radical agenda, kind of creating a pull where the other two countries could sort of find themselves dealing with programs that had been overtaken by history, really. They were designed to do something that was no longer they weren't addressing the current reality. So I don't know if it would be, I'm interested in why, China and India are introducing these subsidies now, and we would wish that they weren't for many reasons, but they are responding to current pressure doing that. And I think and they're not going to give them up for climate arguments. There was also clear in the climate negotiations, a lot of developing countries feel it's almost unethical to talk about mitigating greenhouse gases from the agricultural sector because they've got food security concerns. And I think that unpacking that would be really important. I don't believe that that's true, but I think we do need to maybe come at it. And so come at it from a different place. And I think if we were looking at the subsidies that are looking at water use and quality and soil health and so on, we maybe are speaking to developing countries where they are, and that may be one of the ways in which we can be talking about some of the better subsidies versus others, and you're not doing it for something else, for a problem which they consider was created by other countries, but you're doing it because you're protecting your food security and your adaptive capacity where you live. So that's, I guess, maybe just a last thing about sort of some areas where IATP, my institute, is looking into the future with these questions. One is wanting to do some assessment. There is currently very little kind of climate conditionality on public finance for agriculture. Farm credit doesn't ask you to do a climate risk assessment, for example. Are there some ways in which those things, which I don't know if they count as subsidies or not, but it seems to me more rules on how the public money is used could be positive for where investment happens. And then I'm interested in these projections of what climate change implies for the big agricultural exporters. How long into the future can they presume to produce these vast quantities of crops, which are often produced in quite polluting ways? And does climate change projections support the assumption that food production can continue where it is? And then what does it imply for the distribution channels? So you see the Mississippi drying up, you see barges stuck, you see that problem in Europe. I'm sure you're seeing it elsewhere as well. And so if we are going to think about where agriculture happens most efficiently, even from an environmental point of view, we also have to think about how it will get distributed and what our risk mechanism is to protect us from the fact that, well, and the Ukraine war was an example, we don't always control the distribution system. I'll finish. Thanks you so much.
Sophia, thank you. Thank you very much. You give also the point of view of the agricultural sector not being alone in this world, but connected to the rest of the sectors. So how that also will play a key role in the future. So thank you very much. And with this, we have Joseph Glauber, or Joe. He's Senior Research Fellow here at IFPRI as well. Joe, the floor is all yours.
Great, thanks, Valeria. Valeria asked me to address sort of some of the recent U.S. efforts to address climate change in their agricultural policies. And I think, I mean, these efforts aren't new. Congress back in 2009 debated legislation that would have established caps for greenhouse gases in the energy sector. And agriculture would have had to absorb relatively modest increases from those caps, but they would have been able to sell carbon offsets to the regulated parties in a proposed cap and trade system. Ultimately, the legislation failed for a number of reasons, but as far as what agriculture, their view of it was, they were very much worried about the tax and skeptical about the promise of the benefits of offsets. Moving forward 13 years, we're now climate's back on the agenda, and I think over the last several months, USDA has announced some fairly large initiatives. One is some $3 billion in ad hoc funding that would promote large-scale pilot projects, some of which Sophia mentioned, that would emphasize greenhouse gas benefits. They just released another 300 some odd million this past week to smaller enterprises to sort of encourage climate-friendly practices. And then you have this big piece of legislation that went through Congress this year, the Inflation Reduction Act, which would provide another additional $18 billion for conservation programs over 10 years to address greenhouse gas reductions. There's also some provisions in that to extend tax credits for biodiesel production. I would say that these are fairly modest relative to the $20 billion spent annually in the federal or the U.S. safety net, through the price and income support programs, the existing conservation programs, and then the crop insurance program. I also think to call this repurposing would be a mistake, just in the sense of these aren't replacing the existing subsidies, but they're in addition. And I think while most farm groups are aboard with the idea of spending more money to encourage practices that reduce greenhouse gas emissions or sequester carbon, but they're much less interested in replacing the existing suite of programs. We have a farm bill that will be debated it's already started the debate, but Congress will be busy next year looking at new farm legislation. And I think there the debate's going to be not so much whether or not Congress wants to do something on climate. I think actually there will be a lot of proposals to do that, to get some of this ad hoc practices that are now, or policies that are now operating, would like to see that put into the farm legislation. But the problem is where to find the money. And the question that I said before of taking it out of the pockets of some of these other programs, I just don't think that's likely to happen. In fact, the irony is there has been some repurposing debates over the last several farm bills, and that's been mainly taking the money out of the nutrition programs and putting that into the farm programs. And I don't think that's the direction proponents of repurposing are thinking. I would just echo a couple of things that Sophia mentioned, and and they essentially revolve around program design. I think that's really critical here. I think one thing that a lot of these climate programs, get criticized for is these factors like additionality. How much bang are you really getting for the additional dollars you're spending? Whether or not these practices are verifiable, which I think in some case, actually, because there is an international accounting for greenhouse gases, that becomes important. And then permanence, whether or not, if you're doing it 1 year, that's great. But if indeed you turn up replowing land or whatever, releasing carbon the next year, that's less so. And then lastly, and this is to echo a point that many of the speakers, previous speakers have made, is these programs have to be designed in a way that are compliant with WTO rules. And I think that's very critical here. I mean, some argue that we need to rethink WTO rules. I would argue that there's plenty within the existing regulations or the provisions of the Agreement on Agriculture which would allow for climate smart practices, but they have to be done in a way that don't cause these massive externalities, like putting a lot more subsidized grain on the market or something like that. And with that, I will close.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Joe. That last connection with also what Sophia was mentioning, I think that we will discuss, go into more depth for the Q&A. We're getting some questions that also relates to that. So thank you for bringing that up. And Last but not least, we have Nelson Illescas. He's the director of the INAI Foundation in Argentina. So Nelson, thank you so much for joining us today again, and the floor is all yours.
Well, thanks Valeria and IFPRI for the invitation to be part of this discussion. Well, let me say that the views and the opinions expressed during this presentation are mine and do not necessarily reflect the opinions and views of INAI Foundation or its member. Sorry, but I'm a lawyer, I have to do this. But I like to thank the organization of this seminar, because this discussion is very welcome right now. It's very useful to bring subsidies back to the discussion table. Also, I think it's very relevant to have a discussion on policies based on data. Ken was mentioned at the beginning that data on WTO is outdated. I think that countries must reinforce this transparency obligation with respect to the existing domestic support commitments. It's imperative to have a real understanding of the amounts of subsidies in agriculture. Many of the subsidies are not notified in real time, so we have a lot of work to do on that field. Agriculture support goes largely to agricultural producers. You know that, primarily in form that affect market prices and distort incentives for both producers also and consumers, and all along the value chain. So we have to find a way to avoid this in a more is more than needed. In INAI, we have been working on these topics for a long time. We have been saying that in bilateral or regional negotiations for a trade agreement, we can include a lot of issues, but something remains absent of this kind of negotiation, and that's subsidies. Because for many years, negotiators have been trying to find some language about the topic, and the answer was always the same. Subsidies are part of the multilateral agenda. And okay, one of the I think greatest achievement of WTO was to set limits on the amount of the subsidies for the agriculture sector. And this was complemented by the promotion of the reduction of those subsidies through trade negotiation. After Uruguay round, the idea was keep reducing and keep negotiating, and that was Doha round, but that was more than 20 years ago. Negotiations stagnated, and commitments on subsidy have remained at the level established during the Uruguay round. We are conscious that a total elimination of subsidies is an utopia, but we need new disciplines. New disciplines are essential for subsidies, because the norms or the rules that were established during the Uruguay round do not address a reality that differs greatly from what prevailed when they were established. So important changes have been made in agricultural policies. It was mentioned not only the Farm Bill, but also the Common Agricultural Policy in Europe, and also in developing countries. Nowadays, developing countries are the ones that are subsidizing the most according to OECD. So I think that we have to work on domestic support. I think that we all agree that current support policies need to be better targeted in order to reduce the cost of nutritious food, increase sustainability, make trade freer, and increase farmers' income, among other important issues and objectives. But it's hard to find a balance between all these different goals, because as it was mentioned, some subsidies have significantly contributed to growing production and reducing the price of agricultural products, with positive impacts on food security and farm incomes. But it has some trade-off, some negative side, because they encourage monocultures, cease the farming of certain nutritious food, prevented the development of agriculture in other regions, turning them into importers, and contributed, as it was mentioned, in the emissions of greenhouse gases. With some of the authors that are here, we work into some of the issues in the T20 of Indonesia during this year. And we found out that some recent studies indicates that repurposing or reallocating agricultural support toward investment and incentives that encourage increased productivity, sustainable production practices, and healthy data-rich choices has the potential for a triple win, not only for people, but also for planet and for prosperity. This can be done, for instance, by allocating more public expenditures for agriculture, research and development, rural infrastructure, eco-service, payment for farmers, and so on. And let me finish with two comments. First, I think that reducing domestic support that distort trade and production had been a goal since the creation of WTO, and we must keep pushing for that. This must be in the agenda of WTO, even when we talk about the reform of the WTO. And second, proposal for repurposing agricultural subsidies towards environmentally friendly activities or programs are very welcome. We all agree on that. But they should not serve as an excuse to continue maintaining distorting aid to production and trade, because green protectionism is around the corner. Thank you very much, Valerie.
Thank you, Nelson. Thank you so much for bringing a different perspective to the discussion we were having. So I think that with this, we have many things to keep discussing now at the Q&A. So I would like to start with one question that it was placed by Shadrach Agaki. He's from Communications and Food Policy Expert in Kenya. And he specifically asked this question to David, but I do think that actually many of you can also comment on this because it relates to some of your previous comments. So he says, what David is saying is extremely important, especially in Kenya, where there is a fertilizer subsidy, but people are questioning the effectiveness. One of the critical concerns is the question of soil testing to inform the type and quantity to be applied. So his question is, what will be the best strategy to communicate these policies in a manner that is holistic to cater to all fronts? So David, you can start with this one, please.
Yes, thank you. And particularly this year, the fertilizer question and how we respond to fertilizer prices has been on top of the agenda for many policymakers and many farmers. Now, I think gradually there is really this realization that fertilizer is not the answer to all your problems, and soil health in particular is important. So what you need is to make sure that you use the right amount of fertilizer in the right place for the right crops, but also you care of your soil. And in June in 2023, the African Union is going to host the African Summit for soil health and fertilizer, where some of this will be discussed. But in terms of policy design, it's really where, the complementarity and providing, these services, extension services, for instance, to be able to help farmer maybe has to come hand in hand with fertilizer subsidies. And I would say at the end can be actually even the most important type of policy that policymakers should provide. But now we should not be naive in terms of how some of these policies and subsidies have been used, meaning that the political economy mean that some government like to give, every year payment to farmers or subsidies to farmers for a nice photo ops, but also to get them basically depending on them instead of empowering them with better knowledge and better capacity to be more autonomous. And that's where actually, sometimes we oppose, and maybe it's something that we see in many developed economies where we say, farmers will oppose some of this reform. In the global south, actually, there is many farmers that know that the way that the money is distributed currently create more inequalities, more inefficiencies, and they still aim to get some support, but they are pretty open to rethink how these policies have been designed and implemented, because in particular, the most vulnerable farmers today are not the ones that benefit the most from the policies, and that's where there is a lot of things to do.
Thank you. Ken, do you want to comment on this one as well? Thank you.
Very briefly, look, to agree with everything that David said, the first thing. Second is, I think it's also possible to not just look to governments, but to look to the private sector. So there's a number of agribusinesses, including upstream suppliers, that are doing a lot to make it possible for their products to be used correctly. It makes sense to do that, and if they want to keep a social license to continue to sell synthetic fertilizers and pesticides, they pretty much have to do that. And wherever you are in the world, there are increasingly available simple apps to help you manage to take the place, in some cases, of extension workers that may or may not be available. So yes, look to the government, but I think there's some better connections that can be made across the supply chain as well.
Thank you, Ken, very much. So we have also an anonymous question that says, what is the sustainability record of those countries that don't subsidize so much? Could market-based incentives be used to drive change? I don't know if anybody would like to take the first.
There's not an energetic list of response. The first part I'll leave to somebody else. On the second part, yes, I think market incentives can play a role. So the first step in policy reform is to stop telling people to do things you actually don't want them to do. So remove the disincentives to some of the change in behavior that you're looking for. And I think some. Increasingly, and maybe this is a bit naive, but I believe it, so I'll say it. Sustainability is increasingly becoming a source of competitiveness. And if you are a downstream, if you're a consumer-facing company, you're having to attest to your consumers that you have a sustainable, with many definitions of sustainability, supply chain. And as this translates its way back through the food system, that hopefully there will be, there's not so many yet, but hopefully there will be real market incentives to produce more sustainably, not just because it's good for your own operation, but because in an environmental sense, but because it's profitable to do so as well.
Nelson, thank you very much, Ken. And Nelson, would you like to comment on this?
Yeah, just a small. Well, in Argentina, perhaps you know that we have a negative PSC. We are the opposite of subsidies. We have some other policies that are more affecting production, but we have found a way to produce in a sustainable way, mostly because of response of the market and pushing forward for the private sector. We have initiatives that works on carbon neutrality. We have initiative that works on good agricultural practices that are mostly coming from the private sector, and that I think is a good response to demand that is asking for sustainable products. I think we are working on that. The market is working on that. All the demand of not only on developed countries, but also in developing countries, our consumers are demanding for sustainable products. So I think producers has an awareness on that and are working on that way without subsidies, at least in our country.
Thank you, Nelson, for bringing the perspective from Argentina. And Sophia?
Well, not just to bring a bit of maybe skepticism. I mean, one, yes, there's terrible environmental damage from agriculture in many countries in the world, and not very many countries have these subsidies. So clearly the subsidies are a problem and they are real and we should deal with them, but there's lots of other reasons why agricultural production is not sustainable. And for many, so we need to be looking at other things as well. But then on the second part, I mean, not that you can't use market incentives, but just to recognize that we have had many, many, many years of roundtables for sustainable production, RED Plus programs, so on. They have a pretty shocking track record. And so I think what's really important, one, even in the report from IIT, the power of the consumer in all this is pretty small. I think that was one of the findings that I read. And I think what would be more powerful is the investors. So where are the investors asking for change? And we do see that. We published a report on the greenhouse gas emissions associated with JBS, the meat packer, just before their investor stakeholder meeting last April. And they didn't like that. But they've come back and we've had the argument and had the press coverage that supports what we're saying with the numbers available. There's no transparency over the greenhouse gas emissions of these companies, but what they choose to publish, we can use. And with the methodologies of FAO and others, we can do some calculations. And I think the investors will create a real pressure point, just as the insurance and reinsurance firms have created a pressure point. So just wanted to put that, absolutely believe in market incentives, but let's understand where the power in the market lies. And I feel that the consumer power, the other quick thing is what we've seen in Europe is the consumer pressure onto the supermarket or the meat company or the dairy, then puts pressure back down the chain onto the farmers. So you've seen both a bit of a shifting of production offshore so as to not worry about the environmental standard that the consumer or the populace is asking for, but you also see pressure up the chain to say, you farmer, you better give me something produced differently, not necessarily, sometimes with a financial incentive, but not necessarily with a financial incentive from the buyer who then is supplying the consumer.
Thank you, Sophia, very much. And Joe, you have something to say?
I just want to follow up on it because and get back to some of the studies that were done, and we didn't present any of the results, and they're certainly online and people can look at them. But one of the interesting things that struck me when we first did this, so we did this, David alluded to these models where we have removed subsidies and looked at what the impacts are. I think what you find, and I think this is something that I think Sophia was saying as well, is that one, agriculture is polluting. I mean, there are a lot of externalities connected with agriculture. Subsidies actually have a small part in that. I mean, you can remove that, and I think if in looking at the overall impacts on a lot of these measures of externalities, they're pretty small. I mean, they're small percentage points differences. I mean, oftentimes less than one. That doesn't mean that you can't do a better job with it. I mean, the fact is one can repurpose these subsidies and try to get positive environmental outcomes. And I do think that we are certainly, not only are we seeing it with stockholder pressure on companies, but also just companies deciding to put in private standards and other things. That creates its own set of problems, I think, for a poor developing country that's trying to get their product into those markets when you have this widely different set of standards out there. But there are a lot of ways the private sector and consumers can ultimately have an impact on this. Thanks.
Ken, do you want to say a follow-up comment?
Yeah, just very quickly to Joe's last point, yes, except for land use change. The models don't do a good job, Joe, if I understand well. And much of the impact attributed to negative environmental impact attributed to agriculture is primarily from land use changes. So to the extent that production subsidies bring land that shouldn't be into production, I think there is a pretty clear impact, at least according to the literature.
Thank you. All right, and we have many more questions. So let me ask one more. So why is domestic support for agricultural subsidies such as difficult issue multilaterally? And what's the problem with agricultural subsidies? Maybe Leanne, will you?
I can kick it off, maybe.
Thank you.
So why is it so different multilaterally? I have experience at the WTO working in agriculture, and one of the things that I reflected on a lot was the entitlements that the agreement sets up are different for every single member. And actually that is, it's a historical, comes from history and the way that they were negotiated, but it sits there as something that keeps the rules and entitlements from evolving. At the same time, there's that piece of it that's related to entitlements linked to value of production, which is increasing over time for many, many members. And I think that I think WTO members see that, and they can see that actually having a little more room for maneuver, being less constrained, if you will, is more interesting. And then, there's just hugely diverse policies that are put in place and differences of views across how the rules ought to be applied. And even after 20 plus years, the interpretation of the rules. So yeah, it's a pretty fraught political space. I'll leave it at that because I'm sure there are others who would like to hop in.
Ken.
Yeah, sorry to come in again. There's a pretty basic political economy argument, right? I mean, very high support, very concentrated benefits, very widely distributed costs. So I guess that's the obvious response. But I think it's much more complicated than that, and it kind of derives from the last, simple little chart that David put up, where you have a set of objectives a very long time ago, and those objectives have evolved. I would argue that the policy instruments have not evolved anywhere near as swiftly. They certainly haven't kept pace with the complexity of today's objectives. So there's a narrative around ag policy is good, there's good support for the sector, it's good for rural communities, et cetera, et cetera. It's okay if you say it fast, but if you look at the actual impacts as opposed to the intention that a lot of policymakers have, it doesn't line up. And we are not spending money on climate. We are not spending money on digital applications. We are not spending money on extension service. We are not spending money on ag R&D. We're providing a lot of money in income transfers that look an awful lot like policies 20, 30 years ago. Different names, slightly different parameters. There's been some positive developments, but I don't know. It's the life is much more complicated today than at the time of the origin of many of the policies in place.
Thank you very much, Ken. And let's move to another question. So, to which extent we can target various goals when proposing a policy reform? I think that David mentioned that in his presentation. So David, would you like to start?
Yes. No, so I think that, and to follow up on what Ken has said, we acknowledge that at least in the policy discourse, there is a need to target different goals. Now, I will just be careful that you cannot target too many goals with a limited number of instruments. And we also, as Sophia said, between the farmers and the consumer, there is a longer and longer value chain. And so if you just hope that, people are going to eat more fruit and vegetable by subsidizing at the farm level fruit and vegetables, that's very naive about how, markup evolve, distribution evolve. And just also the fact that you don't want to subsidize, for example, all your consumers. I mean that, and that's something, even the debate we can see in Europe when it's about organic farming, and the government say, okay, we are going to subsidize organic farming. Very good for middle class and upper middle class consumers. But the poorest people doesn't consume these goods, and you are not going to bring the good of organic produce so low that tomorrow everyone will afford to do it. So yes, it's good to have different goals. I think we need also to be rational about what are the policy instruments. And for some government, it's a governance issue. What is the Ministry of Agriculture doing? What is the Ministry of Health doing? You see in some countries actually emerging now with a Ministry of Food and Environment in some cases, because you want to make sure that You have the governance structure that can deal with this trade-off. And if you have too many people around the table, you may never get any decision made. So you need to find the right balance within government and, of course, with other stakeholders. So that's one of the, I will say, main challenge in terms of, yes, we want to transform the food system. We care about different things, but we need to have the governance structure and the policy instrument that deliver on that. And at this stage, we are far from having this ready. I mean, that we should try to do everything with one hammer, but you cannot screw things with a hammer. So diversity of instruments.
Great. Thank you so much, David. And we have time for just one last question. And this question is from Najibullah Hassan Soy. And his question is, how can we improve the efficiency of government support programs? Subsidy itself may create positive outcomes if properly designed and implemented. So I think that most of you cover some of this. Anybody would like to jump in? Sophia.
Just to throw a kind of academic idea out there, but when I was looking at trade and food security for my PhD, there's this concept of adaptive governance out there, and some interesting comparisons of places in our multilateral governance that have built-in feedback mechanisms and have ways of incorporating some science at the same time as it remains governments who negotiate, and therefore a kind of binding outcome. And many, many places in the WTO agreement on agriculture is one where there's very many barriers. Leanne touched on them, many barriers to that adaptive potential. And I feel that if we take, the science of systems seriously and our understanding of food systems and climate change and these interactions, and we know we can't predict everything that's going to happen. There's no possible way to be dealing with perfect knowledge. And so we need to be sure we have feedback. And from our point of view, that feedback should include the communities that are affected by these decisions as well. And that, I think, is where some of the political buy-in would come. So it's kind of an abstract idea. The example that was given was in I guess it was technical barriers to trade. I forget. It was a piece of the WTO that was just having all the time to deal with changing standards. What were permitted levels of various pollutants, or dealing with a problem that was very real with people who just had to find a pragmatic solution and who had experience of it. And I don't know if we can extend that, but I do feel the WTO agreement on ag is hampered by the fact that although the negotiators know a lot about their domestic agriculture policy, they're not really brought to the WTO to talk about that or discuss it. They're brought to the WTO to expand their export market. And I really think that creates an incoherence that we could do without if we had a more adaptive approach.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sophia. And I think that Ken would like to also say something to end this. Thank you.
Just to add, I mean, I think it makes good sense to involve more folks with a stake in the exercise. That includes communities, it includes upstream businesses. I've attended, I don't know how many agriculture ministerial meetings in the last decade or two. It's no problem to get agriculture ministers to agree that their current policy package doesn't work. It doesn't work as intended. And they kind of sort of look in the same direction for how it should be reformed. Not exactly, but sort of. Which is, I guess, brings me back to this little report of ours, that we basically looked at work that everybody else had did and came to a conclusion. Like, we're not telling the story very well. There's a lot of information available, but it isn't being woven together consistently. The message isn't getting through that you don't need to go to zero. What you need to do is a better job of what you say you want, and finding some ways to make that happen instead of just making the same mistakes and expecting a different outcome.
Thank you, Ken, very much. And before we end this, I would like to also give the floor to Peter Draper. He's Executive Director of the Institute for International Trade from the University of Adelaide as well. He will give some concluded remarks. Peter, it's so nice to have you here with us.
And thanks, Valeria, and thanks to the panel for a great discussion. Certainly for a non-agriculture specialist like myself, it's been very illuminating. I think there's a tremendous range of commendable technical work on this topic, but as Ken just reminded us, the messages are not really getting through. Certainly I can say that Australians, I'm based in Australia, are extremely interested in this topic. In Australia, there's a main mover behind the cans group, of course, with a strong interest in the outcome. I just hope that policymakers have been listening very carefully to this conversation as it's evolved. I just wanted to summarize a couple of key messages that I took out. There were many, so these are just the highlights for me. The first related to something that Sophia Murphy said, and a particular phrase she used, which is that we need to harness the avalanche of private money seeking offsets. I think the role of the private sector in all of this is extremely important. It does raise other questions. Is the private sector also looking for subsidies? Might be a question we may ask, and if so, what are the dangers of that? Certainly, there's a lot of reform and momentum that could be harnessed behind that. The second key message that I took out is that we need to ensure that agriculture support works as intended. This goes to the heart of the repurposing debate. But we need to be precise, as David reminded us, in defining what is harmful and what is not. And partly that's about attaching climate risk to agriculture in a more systematic way, which also gets back to the role, I think, of the private sector. And I think we heard very clearly throughout the conversation that trade-offs still matter. They haven't gone away. They're still very complicated. Perhaps a systems-based approach, as Leanne Jackson suggested, is one way to think about this. That's very complicated, of course, but that doesn't make it less important. But that also highlights that the politics of reform, as we all know, are extremely challenging. And so, as Ken told us, we've been at this for 45 years. We've made all the economic arguments vis-a-vis agricultural subsidies reform in its own right, but we haven't seen much progress, and every Australian and his dog will tell you that. So we need new ideas, we need new approaches. How do we bring together the legal discussions in the WTO, the economic discussions in the OECD, into the political space in ways that would make this actually happen, so that there's a new chemistry and a new reform momentum? Big questions. We don't necessarily have the answers. But I wanted to end on the note that Ken began with, and one of the reasons that we put this report together, which is that business as usual is not working. I think we all know that we need new ideas. Ken offered a couple. There's certainly some in the report. For example, maybe a new plurilateral on agriculture in the WTO that brings the main players together. It is conceivable. The politics, of course, are very challenging. That doesn't make it not worth trying. That should be seen as part of a broader subsidies reform package. It is, as Ken told us, the new growth industry. So how do we manage that in a broader context? I think, and we certainly make this case in the report, that a more activist approach is required. So building that reform coalition, mobilizing the kinds of technical arguments and evidence that we've just spoken about. But it also needs to navigate the different values at stake, as Leanne reminded us, and there are many different values at stake. So how do we do that in new creative ways, bringing the key stakeholders to the table? That's a big question, one that we're certainly interested in. So I'll end on that point. Thanks to everybody again for a great conversation, and to IFPRI for hosting this webinar.
Peter, thank you very much. And before I end, I would like just to thank again the University of Adelaide, Peter and Ken, for co-organizing the event with us, USAID and the also the Australian Foreign Ministry for funding, and then our colleagues, Nelson, Sophia, Leanne, and thank you very much for joining us today. Your comments and everything was They were superb. And then my colleagues from IFPRI, David and Joe, of course, I thank you so much for being always there and for doing great work. I definitely love working with you, but also from our communications colleagues that they were also make this event possible. So Joanna, Michael, Jamet, Sarah, Mabel, thank you so much for everything. And with this, have a good day, good rest of the day, evening, and happy holidays to everyone. And of course, that happy World Cup